Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar hosted by Accountability to present the revised AA1000 Accountability Principles. My name is David Pritchett. I'm the Global Head of Research with Accountability. And over the course of the next hour, I'll be hosting this webinar, and we'll have my co-presenters, Dong-Soo Kim, who's a Accountability Standards Board member, and Murray Sace, who was the chair of the working group of the AA1000 Accountability Principles revision process, also speaking with me. We will take the time also at the end of the webinar to have a Q&A with the participants. Now, the purpose of this webinar is to present an overview to all of you of the new principles and to focus primarily on what has changed, because we realize that a lot of you on this call would be existing users of the principles. We will go through what has been improved. We will compare from a technical basis the adherence criteria to the previous version dated in 2008 to be transparent on all the different elements which would have changed. I'm delighted to be joined on this webinar by two co-presenters, as I mentioned. Dong-Soo Kim from Korea. Dong-Soo is a member of the AA Standards Board, and he is chair of our AA1000 AP Steering Committee. He's been instrumental in the successful development of this document, and we're very pleased to have him with us. Dong-Soo is the director of the Sustainability Management Center at the Korea Productivity Center, that some of you may know, in Seoul, in Korea. He's a recognized expert on an international level in sustainability assessment, ratings, stakeholder research, materiality analysis, and the development of sustainability guidelines, standards, and policies. After my introduction, Dong-Soo will present an overview of the AA1000 Principles revision process. The second co-presenter is Murray Sace. Murray was the chair of the AA1000 AP working group over the last 24 months. Murray is a principal within the Corporate Responsibility CVS team at ERM in the UK. He oversees a lot of client projects in the field of independent certification and verification services in the area of sustainability, and he has close to 20 years experience in this field. We were very lucky to have him as our chair of the working group, and he brought a lot of experience to this role. Following on from Dong-Soo, Murray will present a high-level overview of the purpose, scope, and advantages, as well as some of the key high-level changes of the AA1000 AP. After Murray, I will then present a short technical overview of the four principles, and I will introduce the changes to the adherence criteria, as well as the new criteria for impact. After that, we'll have time for a Q&A. It's important to us that the participants on this webinar have the opportunity to pose questions. Since the release of the AP documents, we've been receiving through our standards email address a lot of different questions. And as you get to know and get a feel for the adherence criteria, for the new principles and revised terminology, we understand that there will be questions in that process. You can submit your questions throughout the webinar. You don't have to wait till the Q&A session. You can submit your questions in written form using the Q&A button on your controls. Udaya Nanayakara, who manages our standards secretariat in London at Accountability, will moderate this session. But before we dive into the AA1000 Accountability Principles, I wanted to provide a short overview of our organization for those of you who may not be familiar with us. Accountability is a long-standing 20-year-old global standards and consulting firm that works with business, governments, and multilateral organizations to advance responsible business practices and improve ultimately their long-term performance. We have over 2 decades of experience in developing standards to support sustainability-related management and reporting. A number of you would have worked alongside us during this journey as we've developed standards of the AA1000 series over this time. Accountability, you may remember, notably pioneered the concept of materiality in a sustainability setting in the early 2000s. So here on the screen now, you have the AA1000 series of standards and guidelines, which incorporate 3 primary documents. The foundation document, and the one which is the topic of this webinar, is the Accountability Principles, the AA1000 AP version 2018. This document will replace within time the AA1000 APS, which was an Accountability Principles Standard 2008. And a quick word on the effective dates for the AP, as we've had questions on this recently from both assurance providers and organizational users. For us, it's important that we provide a transition period for the users and the assurance providers to transition effectively to the revised principles and the new principle of impact. So for all reports published before the 1st of January 2021, organizations are able to continue to use the AA1000 APS 2008 version. The transition period can be used to work towards the adherence of the new criteria for impact, for example, or some of the revised criteria for the other principles. We do encourage organizations to start working with the new principles as of today in their 2018 reporting cycle. But for the 2020 reporting cycle, where reports are published after the 1st of January 2021, the AA1000 AP will be the only effective principles, and the APS will be discontinued at that time. We also have an AA1000 assurance standard, the AS standard, which is very closely linked to the AP because that is the standard which is used by our external verifiers to verify the adherence criteria to the accountability principles of the user organizations. A number of you on this webinar, looking at the participant list, will be using this in your assurance work. We work with just over 200 licensed assurance providers or individual companies in our work. This document, the AS document, is planned for a revision. We wanted to revise this alongside the AA1000 principles. Due to resource constraints, we couldn't run both the processes in parallel, and in discussion with the working group of the AA1000 Assurance Standard 2008, we prioritized the updating of the accountability principles, which the working group felt was due for a refresh, given the changes in terminology and the usage of some of the principles over the last 10 years. The AA1000 AS working group will begin work later this year, and we hope that process will take approximately 12 months. You will be updated on that through regular updates through our website. Otherwise, any updated information can be sourced from our standards organization and the standards email. The third document you see here is the AA1000 Stakeholder Engagement Standard, the AA1000 SES. This document establishes the benchmark for leading practice in stakeholder engagement practices, and it's an open source leading practice framework which is used by many thousands of companies around the world and audited by some, but the purpose of the document is not that it's an auditable standard. So before I hand over to Dong-Soo, we'd like just to run 2 short poll questions with you to get a feeling for the experience of the participants who are on this webinar with regard to using the AA1000 principles. That will help us a little bit when we're talking about the changes to pitch to the right level of the audience. So Dai, if you wouldn't mind, please launching these 2 poll questions. The poll question number 1 you should see on your screens. The question is, what is your prior knowledge of the AA1000 accountability principles? And you have 5 different possible answers here. I'll give you 20, 30 seconds or so.
We've got close to 30% of the participants who have voted, so we'll keep the polling open for a few more seconds. So a few more votes coming in, and I will close the poll in the next few seconds.
Good, thanks, Daya. Good, we have the majority of the participants who have used the principles as an assurance provider. That was consistent with the participant list that we saw before the webinar. The second most popular answer, second most popular answer is you've used the principles as an organizational user, or you are aware of it, but you have not used it before. So there will be some new users to this and who wouldn't have used the principles before. And we will ensure that we are clear on some of the adherence criteria for that purpose. Okay, thank you. The second polling question now is related to the region where you're dialing in from. It's always useful for us to get a sense of the breadth of those participating in the webinar today. Uday, if you could launch the second question, please. Right, the second question, results are in. Looks like you've closed that one. With the majority of companies dialing in from Europe, second most number of companies dialing in from Asia, which is to be expected for the time frame that we've posted for this webinar. Great, thank you very much, everybody, for your time there. And now I'll pass over the control to Dong-Soo, who will provide a short overview of the AA1000 revision process for you. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for the introduction to the new principles. I am Dong-Soo Kim from the Standards Board and the Steering Committee, and I would like to briefly go over the AA1000 AP revision process. In June 2016, the timeline for releasing the AA1000 AP were agreed on. The mandate of the Steering Committee was extended to include the AA1000 AP Working Group. AA1000 AP Working Group is composed of 12 people from various backgrounds and regions across the world, including the US, UK, Germany, Russia, Australia, Malaysia, and India. Assurance providers and the professionals of sustainability, CSR, and environment were included in the process. Also, we consider the gender balance. Early in 2017, the working group conducted a public consultation to receive feedback from multi-stakeholders to make amendments on draft through a web-based platform. After the consultation, we received the draft from the working group, and the Steering Committee went over the review session. The working group contributed their expertise through several discussions and consensus for the final draft. They shared the consultation result to the Steering Committee, which was then reported to the board for final approval and successful release. And then with the board's approval, the final version of AA1000 AP was officially introduced. I believe the new principles applied the social needs and market demand for impact measurement and evaluation. Still, we understand it needs more time for the change to be successful. I mean, your practice and your participation and feedback. And it is a journey, and it is successfully launched, but still we need to work on through the course. As we are well aware of the need for the transition period of applying the new principle, as David Pritchett explained, we went through in-depth cooperation with the working group for soft transition. We expected this to incorporate some practical insights and feedback from the assurance providers and users while helping everyone to apply the new principles. Especially for the new principle impact, through research and public consultation was highly helpful for the draft to be developed for our stakeholders to especially understand and apply the new principles. I would like to thank every working group member for their efforts and the work as a standard board member. I would like to give a special thanks to Marie Says, the chair of a working group who dedicated the whole process from achieving objectives, providing deep insight, and conveying communication between the working group members and the steering committee, as well as David Pritchell, who led the accountability team to make everything real. I will now pass this to Maurice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dong-Soo. Through a number of issues, just to give you an overview of the new accountability principles, and David will give you more detail on the technical content and criteria involved. So in terms of the purpose of the principles, obviously it's a set of guiding principles to assess and manage and ultimately communicate performance, but it's important that organizations also understand the potential impacts of opportunities, activities beyond traditional boundaries, and the principles sets out to help them do just that. It's no longer a standard, so it is less prescriptive and provides a wider framework, and therefore the intention is wider appeal and applicability. What's noticeable in front of you is that new impact principle in the middle of the diagram, and this is to reflect the growing need for greater accountability across organizations. And the other three principles that surround it in the outer shell, most of you will probably be familiar with. As a quick recap, obviously inclusivity is to identify and engage stakeholders for strategic responses to material issues. Materiality is identifying and prioritizing most relevant, most important sustainability issues. And then responsiveness is how an organization reacts to those issues and related impacts and priority stakeholder needs. So there'll be more on the new principle of impact later, but essentially it is the effect of behaviors of performance and ultimately outcomes of organizations on the economy, on environment, on society, and particularly specific stakeholder groups, of course. So if we've now considered the scope of the new principles, we can make some comparisons with its predecessor, obviously. It's wide-ranging. It reaches out to all organizations, both public and private, essentially all entities with a potential impact, and importantly, entities with the will to make a difference, to make changes, and to drive performance improvement. So the new principles cast a wide net, mentioned before, to give it greater appeal in the interests of encouraging accountability and encouraging and driving improved performance across business, but also across society by extending reach beyond business interests. More on that later. The principles guide organizations to implement processes and practices against principles adherence criteria. This is to be done in a verifiable way, and therefore used in conjunction with the assurance standard becomes a very powerful management tool. The principles offer compatibility with other frameworks, widely recognized frameworks internationally. By being less prescriptive, it's able to do that. So really the intention is to enhance and not to compete. They bring a more holistic view to sustainability management, to apply and make changes through an organization's processes and activities, not just the communications and the reporting, but to affect an organization's activities right through. But it's important that what the contribution really is to the breadth and the depth of that communication piece at the end of the day. And importantly, the principles are to be applied beyond traditional reporting boundaries. So using models of control and influence to reach into the value chain, and obviously the important partnerships therein that can be affected positively. And if we look at the advantages of the new principles, this is not an exhaustive list, but it gives some headline examples of advantages that can be gleaned. So the principles share space with other high-profile standards. They're compatible with those standards, with those frameworks. And the combination of the principles used together in varying degrees have long-term sustainability performance in mind. The introduction of the new impact principle is designed, developed to guide and to push organizations further regarding their behavior, their effectiveness, and ultimately the outcomes of that. And with stakeholders at the core, the whole accountability ethos, if you like, the intent is to build responsive processes that address common concerns and issues of trust. So used with the assurance standard, which has been mentioned, it brings a high level or an increased level of confidence in disclosures because of the greater granularity over adherence criteria. The combined process should draw conclusions against the principles themselves, should bring greater transparency, greater credibility to actions and to reporting if used effectively. So I mentioned the ethos around stakeholders, and the intent is to build stakeholder relations, in part by bringing focus to governance, to strategy, to policy making. It ensures risks, opportunities, and issues that matter the most to companies, to organizations, are managed responsibly, as well as managed responsively. So that's a very important part in bringing those principles together. And by linking stakeholders more closely with decision making, the new principles bring more rigor to that decision-making process and the information that feeds into and comes out of that process. So I think that gives you just a snapshot of some of the advantages. Organizations are at different stages of maturity, will use principles in different combinations and so on, and may realize slightly different advantages, but essentially there is more to be had than we see in front of us. Let's just consider the overall changes before I pass over to David on the technical criteria. Really rounding up between the old and the new, the principles as a framework no longer carry the expectations of a more prescriptive standard, so introduce that greater flexibility to users. And the impact principle itself is more results-based, therefore more results-driven, and look for the outcome of behavior, of performance, of effectiveness of organizations used in conjunction with its fellow principles. There's been a restructure of the principles, which brings a very clear definition and explanation to the users, and the technical supporting information really guides organizations strongly on how to implement both their internal processes, but also the assurance process around their governance, their strategies, their policy making, ultimately their reporting, and so on. And then the infographics used in the new principles are very dynamic. They connect the principles and how they interact. And that will depend obviously on the organization's state of maturity and application of the principles, but maturity in terms of its sustainability journey as well. And in addition to linking with other accountability standards, that compatibility the principles have with wider sustainability frameworks is maintained by using sufficiently generic terminology for wider appeal and wider application. I think to conclude, if I had to do that in as few words as possible, I'd say, always with the caveat if used effectively and as intended, that the 2018 principles should enhance and should drive the position, the practice, and the performance of organizations from a governance level through to the outcomes, building trust and credibility in the process. Hope that's given you a good overview. I'm going to pass on to David now for more detail on the principles and criteria.
Thank you, Murray. A very good overview of the key advantages that we foresee. These have been shared with us kindly by the users and the assurance providers during the process of revision, as well as an overview of some of the changes. What I would like to do over the next 15 minutes or so, to give us still 20 minutes for a Q&A, is to briefly run through each of the new principles. I will present to you, if you haven't downloaded the document yet from our website, I'll present to you the infographic that Murray was talking about, which is been introduced to the new principles. We didn't have infographics in the previous ones, and that really helps to portray the dynamic nature of the different principles and how they interlink and how they play out with strategy, performance, reporting, etc. Each of the principles has been restructured. You'll see the enhanced long definition on the slides that I'm going to present, and that will give you a flavor of the definition that we've applied. It went through a lot of discussion. Dong-Soo was very exhaustive in his description of the revision process. It took a long time. There was a lot of people involved. We're very grateful to have the insights of experienced users of the standards, as well as regulation and multilateral organizations who have also imposed standards in their sectors, and to gain from these experiences. I will also obviously focus on the adherence criteria in this section for each of the principles, and what has changed, and what may be some of the new adherence criteria that you may not be so familiar with. So beginning with inclusivity, and the short definition here is for us as accountability is that people should have a say in the decisions that impact on them. The definition that you see on the screen has been extended from the previous definition to include the second part of the definition, which is on the right-hand side of the slide at the bottom, the second sentence, to include an inclusive organization, and to more formally link the definition of inclusivity to the concept of impact. Previously, we interchangeably used influence and impact, and we assumed a level of impact in the definitions of the principles, and now with the introduction of impact as an underlying or an overarching principle, as you saw in the initial infographic of the placement of the principles, we've purposefully added the element of impact into the definitions where that is appropriate, of course, of the existing principles. The new and revised adherence criteria for inclusivity. Now there's 5 primary changes here. We still have 10 adherence criteria. We've kept those as consistent as possible where those have been still effective and beneficial from the experiences that we've gleaned from our users and the assurance providers who we reached out to. The primary changes you'll see on the right-hand side under each of the 3 subheadings of the adherence criteria in this principle. The first one is to underline the importance of commitment from the highest governing body of the organization. For a company, for a listed company perspective, this would mean for us at the board of directors level. If it was a public organization or not-for-profit organization, this could be, for example, the board of governors or equal level of governance. The second major change in the adherence criteria focuses on the integration of stakeholder engagement, more specifically into relevant policies, procedures, and systems to support an organizational strategy and governance and operational management. We receive feedback from users that the previous adherence criteria around this area was a little vague and unspecific, and we were recommended to tighten the definitions of what we would expect assurance providers to review with their organizations, or what we would expect organizations to undertake to meet the criteria. In the area of engagement strategy and process development, we've added specifically the element here of stakeholder and engagement risks. We've shifted the overall positioning of the principles towards and to better encompass the risk management function and the compliance management function within an organization, who we see play an important role in this process and may have been a little unspecific in that area in the previous version. In the third area, which is performance management and stakeholder communication, you'll see that we've enhanced the terminology and the use of the word metrics, which replaces terminology such as outcomes or outputs, and specifies what we're looking for there. We also specified a little bit more around the communication with stakeholders, aligned with the boundaries of disclosure. Here we recognize that many engagement procedures and activities which are undertaken may be public in nature, may be open source and transparent in terms of communication, but there may well be others in certain situations which are confidential, which are not able to be published, are not able to be communicated on a detailed level, and many are nowadays subject to Chatham House rules when there's multi-stakeholder dialogue processes, and it's important that communication obviously respects those levels of confidentiality. Moving on now to the principle of materiality. The infographic here you'll see is a slightly updated infographic from our previously used infographics in materiality that we had in the early 2000s, and in the mid 2000s we had a materiality report which portrayed the double loop system of materiality impacting strategy and performance, as well as reporting and engagement. This is an area which has proliferated greatly in the last 10 years, the understanding of the word materiality, the application of materiality assessment processes within organizations of a private and a public nature has increased significantly since the 2008 version of the principles. So there was a need to refresh the adherence criteria here to align with some of the perspectives, insights, and thoughts and experiences of using this in practice. In short, for us, materiality means decision makers should identify and be clear about the sustainability topics that matter. That's our short definition of materiality. On the screen here, you have the longer definition, which has been enhanced to cover both the identification and prioritization of the most relevant sustainability topics. Previously, the specifics around prioritization were not sufficiently clear. We've also extended the definition to cover impact, again, in a similar vein as the inclusivity definition, and the time frame element has come in to the definition, as you'll see in the second sentence, the short, medium, and or long term, as the time element was missing in the previous definition. And that's been specified a little bit more in the explanation you will see in the document itself. There's always an explanation, explanatory notes and technical notes around what we mean and understand by the definition of materiality. In terms of adherence criteria, we have revised notably 4 of the criteria that you'll see here. The details of those are on the right-hand side again. The new criteria, these are the 2018 criteria on the left-hand side in the box. Similar change to inclusivity, we emphasize the need for senior management involvement in the materiality assessment process. This is in the commitment, integration, and capacity building area, as well as cross-functional involvement. So we've specified these 2 terms more clearly in the adherence criteria. Criteria number 4 in the materiality determination process, obviously this is the area which has been significantly enhanced due to the experiences that we've learned from the practice. Criteria 4 is completely new in this version, setting clear and consistent boundaries, purpose, time, period, and scope where assumptions are documented. We notably see materiality has been used in multiple different scenarios and with multiple different scopes from both a public and a private perspective, and it was needed to have more flexibility in the application of the principles, but by doing so we need the organizations to set clear and consistent boundaries so that the reader understands the extent of the coverage and the scope of the materiality processes. There's been a slight rearrangement in the adherence criteria number 4 till 9 for further clarification and further accentuation of some of the key points. Some of these areas became a little bit confused from some of the assurance providers, and so we've taken the time to segregate and isolate some of the specific criteria more clearly. The communication area, so the last of the three sub-areas, extends also to prioritization to meet the extended definition of materiality that I just mentioned earlier. And moving on to the third of the four principles, responsiveness. Here you'll see an infographic which is consistent with the infographic of materiality a couple of slides ago, and it lends off that and meets that, and the dynamic is consistent and aligned. In short, for us, responsiveness means that organizations should act transparently on material sustainability topics and their related impacts. The longer definition here, which you'll see on the screen, has been extended and further clarified. There is the link to impact in the definition. We've also introduced the first part of the definition, which you'll see on the screen. That's a new part of the definition, that it's concerning an organization's timely and relevant reaction to material sustainable topics and their related impacts. Now, in terms of the adherence criteria here, again, you'll see the changes transparently that have been done on the right-hand side with the 5 core areas mentioned. There's some consistencies here with the previous principles. We've underlined the need for senior management involvement and cross-functional involvement, which you'll see in the adherence criteria under the commitment subheading. We've added a clearer reference to competencies and resources to respond using a range of response types. Again, responsiveness for us does not only mean communications. Responsiveness as a reminder does mean how an organization shapes its strategy, how an organization develops its policies, how an organization rolls out its programs and activities, and how an organization behaves with regard to the stakeholder. But it is also around communication, and this has grown in diversity significantly in the last decade since we've been working with the APS. And so it's important that we wanted to highlight the competences and resources to meet the different response types that have been added, because these have grown significantly in diversity. And we have a new criteria, number 6, which is to validate the proposed responses internally and externally, where appropriate, of course, to ensure the feasibility to deliver reasonable and viable responses. This was felt from the consultation period and from the working group as an area of importance, which was not sufficiently highlighted in the adherence criteria. We've also restructured a little bit some of the criteria here, numbers 4 till 6, to clearly isolate some of the key points that we wanted to cover. In terms of the communication, in the third sub-issue, we emphasize the use here of suitable reporting principles, frameworks, and guidelines that support comparability of information. Now, this again, as we've talked about on this webinar, with the proliferation of different sustainability standards on an international level, on a national level, in a sector level, and has created a lot of challenges for organizations in which ones they should align to. And it's important for us to see ours is complementary and it extends and links to all of these standards and guidelines, and doesn't conflict with any of them, but it's important to push for comparability of information where that is possible. Finally, moving on to the principle of impact, which will be new for many of you who haven't read the Accountability AP document since we released it earlier this summer. Impact is the new principle. It's one which was subject to a lot of discussion, a lot of debate within both accountability within the accountability board and within the working group that we set up and that was tailored to support us in this revision process. It was also subject to a lot of debate in the public consultation period, and it was very tricky to come to a unanimous position on how we wanted to portray impact. For us, it was our aim was to acknowledge the different existing frameworks that address impact, and there are a lot of them now which are upcoming. There's some have been existing for a longer period of time, and others are emerging on a yearly basis. But we also wanted to have a definition which was generic enough that it can be applied and inclusive enough that it can be applied by organizations of all sizes, sectors, and geographies. Now, that's the primary aim and purpose of the accountability principles, to be inclusive. And so setting a bar which would have been too challenging or too stringent would have risked losing the motivation for smaller organizations or for potentially non-publicly listed organizations with more limited resources to actually go forward with adhering to the accountability principles. And we also wanted to ensure that the set of adherence criteria here, the newly developed set of adherence criteria, was specific enough that an assurance provider could apply a good level of professional judgment, could do sufficient and appropriate testing to come to a conclusion over the quality of the adherence to the different criteria. During this process, we did look at a large number of international frameworks that contribute to the debate around impact. I'm thinking here of engaging with the GRI in how they've been in the Global Reporting Initiative, and the IIRC in how they've been discussing the notion and the concept of impact. We've looked at the broader impact measurement and management tools that some of the larger professional services companies are offering to larger clients primarily. We've connected with the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, who've been doing a lot of research in this space, noted primarily around the environmental impact side, but extending now to the social impact. We were lucky to have a member of the World Bank Group on our working group, and she was able to set up very constructive discussions with UN organizations and World Bank Group organizations who have been working with the topic of impact over the last few decades in terms of environmental and social impact assessments and things like that. We also looked at the financial services space, where there are information around impact investing. We've looked at the London Benchmarking Group guidelines and standards, which also look at impact largely from a social perspective, and various others in different sectors and different geographies which do look at the notion of impact. So there's a lot out there. We didn't want to summarize it and to blend it into something which was meaningless at the end, but we did want to keep very aligned to the level of information that we have with our existing principles and how they are portrayed in the principles standard. In short, for us, impact is about organizations monitoring and measuring and being accountable for how their actions affect their broader ecosystems. And here on this slide, you will see the adherence criteria. The adherence criteria are listed here for those of you who haven't seen it yet. We've looked for consistency in the criteria across the other principles. And so you will see it's important that we're able to build synergies with existing organizational processes and the assurance requirements for the new principles. Criteria 1 to 4 largely fit to the commitment, integration, and capacity building areas. You'll be very familiar with those. If you've used the accountability principles, you'll see that they align very much with a process-driven approach and looking very much at the senior management involvement, the cross-functional involvement that I talked about earlier. That there's integration within the organization to different functions, such as risk management compliance, as I mentioned earlier, which has been brought out a little bit more strongly in this version. And the competencies and resources comes up as well as a key criteria. Criteria 5 till 9 are the criteria that we expect companies will focus on fairly heavily. These are the ones which set the impact identification and metrics development process. Companies, there's a lot of different levels of maturity in this area, and we expect a lot of advancement with these areas of criteria in the coming years. These focus on as I mentioned, the identification and metrics development process, which we really feel companies can work on. If you look at the advancement of the materiality assessment process in the last 5 to 6 years, we expect a similar level of enhancement in the impact identification and metrics development criteria going forward. Criteria 10 is around impact assessment and disclosure, and again is largely aligned to the definition of impact and consistent with the other adherence criteria of the other principles. Good. That concludes the technical overview of the principles. We will now move to the Q&A session, and I've seen that there have been a number of questions have been coming in from the audience, which is great. Thank you very much. We will address as many of the questions as we can in this session. If there are questions that we're unable to answer due to time, or we need to reflect on a more in-depth response to each of the questions, we will be issuing a frequently asked questions document on the back of this webinar, which will address a lot of the questions that have come up during the 2 webinars. There was one on Wednesday, and as well as the questions that have come to accountability over the last month or so since we've released the accountability principles into the market. So you will all be able to benefit from the types of questions and clarification that the assurance providers and organizational users have been asking us. Good. Adai, would you like to moderate this session shortly and read out the questions which have come in from the audience, please?
Yes, thank you, David. We've got a few questions already come in, and for those of you who have any questions and have not submitted them yet, you can do so by clicking the Q&A icon and typing in your questions, which I will then put together, given the time limitations, into different themes and then read it out to our panelists to answer. So moving on to one of the questions that have been received, it is regarding the move from the previous standards to principles. And the question is, do you expect the change from standard to impact on assurance? And I think this question could be taken on by David.
Sure, yes, I can answer this question and pass this to also to Mari and Dong Su if they have a point of view on this. This was something that we discussed quite in depth. It's a small item if you're looking at the nature of the terminology. Do we call it a standard or not? The reason that we changed and we moved and we deleted the S from the APS to become the AP principles guidance document was the confusion in the market with regard to the application of accountability standards. Now, as the assurance providers will know, who are providing assurance over the principles, the standard that needs to be used to provide assurance over the accountability principles is the AA1000 AS, which is the baseline foundation standard which guides the assurance provider in terms of the type of assurance project that this is the level of assurance, the scope of assurance, what is required in an assurance statement, and some of the testing procedures, details around the testing procedures and independence and conclusions and things like that. So those kind of topics are contained in a standard, and that is the assurance standard, which underpins the verification or the assurance of the principles. By having the principles as a separate standard, it was confusing to both the organizational users and some of the new and emerging licensed assurance providers which standard they should actually be using in their work. So now we hope it's going to be clear, and we will reinforce this message when we revise the AA1000 assurance standard. That is the actual standard which is used, and the principles are guiding document to sustainability management. But please, Murray, Dong-Soo, both of you are users of the accountability principles and have been part of this conversation and decision to
Yes,
move
so
away from standard.
thanks, David. I'll just add to that, if I may. From an assurance provider's point of view, the important thing is to have a clear set of relevant criteria. Referential need not be a standard, provided the assurance standard itself is being applied. The referential in this case becomes the principles, which provide underpinning clear definition around around the criteria anyway. So I believe the new accountability principles do just that. The old ones, the predecessor did too, but the new principles have made that criteria clearer for assurance users. So I think that sits very well.
Hi, this is Dong-Soo. I also agree with both David and Murray, and not just for practitioner side for assurance, but also assurance users like the corporate side. The purpose of the AA1000 AP is to provide, user groups, especially corporate side, with a practical set of accepted guidance framework, which they can assess and manage, improve, also communicate with internal and external stakeholders. With this perspective, I think it has a variety of options for different user groups. So.
Dong-Soo, and we also have a related question regarding the document evidence of adherence to the criteria. And there's a question regarding that, that is regarding the organization formally documenting evidence and the requirement in the case of an assurance process against the principles. I think I'll direct this question to Murray, and then maybe David could provide his view as well.
Okay, thank you. Yes, and this question does come up in the assurance world, the need to document evidence. And I think international standards generally are moving away from this formalization of documentation and requesting organizations to document both procedures and evidence, actually, as long as it's subjective and I think satisfactory, relevant to the information that's being assured, then things need not be documented. I think it's probably also quite acceptable to think that certain things have to be. But other things in terms of, the implementation of strategies, for example, sometimes it's more difficult to define the evidence, but through the assurance process, particularly with a solid set of criteria behind that assurance process, makes it feasible to test, to challenge, and to, should we say, gain a level of confidence over that. So there's no yes or no answer to that, actually. I think based on judgment, the organization should know and the assurance provider should know when to expect documented evidence to be presented or not.
Yes, this is an area which we don't prescribe very heavily in our assurance standard, where that would be the place that we would be looking at this, and that's going to be part of the revision process of the assurance standard. What level of guidance and testing requirements and levels do we need to prescribe in a guidance document? We very much trust and quality review the professional judgment of an assurance provider that an organization will be working with. And Murray has given you the viewpoint of one of those. It's important for the assurance provider to undertake sufficient appropriate evidence gathering procedures and testing to come to their conclusion. And ultimately, depending on what the conclusion comes into the assurance report, we expect that there would have been sufficient evidence provided for the assurance provider to come to that conclusion. And this doesn't need to be formalized in every single way, but it could be shown through different types of manifestation, discussion, interview, and participation in events or panel meetings, etc., of the assurance provider. So it really depends on the situation, on the circumstance. And thank you, Murray, for mentioning sort of in a broader perspective with the new set of standards how this debate is, where it's actually currently heading. I think that's relevant.
In view of time limitations, we'll just take one final question, and it's with regard to the length of time since the last accountability principle standard was released in 2008, and the new principles that were released in 2018. And as mentioned, there's also a revision process for the AA1000 assurance standard ongoing. And so I will direct this question to Dong-Soo and maybe quickly cover up with David. So the question is, will the review and revision process of the standard be more up to date in the future to accommodate the ever-changing market around the world?
Thank you for the question. I think it is also needed, but not very short-term period, but periodically it will be reviewed to capture to burgeoning different options. But completely burgeon will take time because sustainability landscape changes. We will incorporate these changes in our burgeoning, but not the entire set of contents. But it is also discussed internally that we periodically capture market landscape changes.
Yes, thank you, Dong-Soo, for taking the question. As you said, this is a topic for the Standards Board. It has been one on many of the board agendas. We felt that the time was right after 8 years to update the principles. We very much went about this revision process with the aim of setting a relevant set of criteria and a relevant set of principles for the upcoming foreseeable future. We as an organization don't plan to jump on every small little change, potential change to the principles or to the standards. However, we do realize that the landscape is moving very quickly. As a case in point here, we updated the AA1000 stakeholder engagement standard in 2015 from a previous version in 2011, and we are already looking at the possibility of updating that again in 2019 because there's been a number of areas which have come to light, which could be improved on and could be updated to etc. And so it's a perennial topic that we're looking at with the board, and should there be a need, we will apply the resources to make sure that happens.
Thank you, David. That concludes the Q&A section, and that completes the hour for the webinar. If you would like to say any concluding remarks and wrap up, please.
Sure, thank you, Daya, for moderating that. Appreciate the questions have come in. I'm not sure that we've had a chance to answer all of them, but as I said, we will follow up. You will have an opportunity to ask any questions which you haven't submitted yet to our standards@accountability.org website. I thank both my co-presenters here for taking the time, the generosity, not only on this webinar, but throughout the whole revision process of the accountability principles. Their insights and their availability and their professionalism has been fantastic. We couldn't have achieved this result without them, and the full team of the working group equally. So thank you very much for participating in the webinar, Mari and Dong-Soo, and equally thank you to all for joining us from the different regions around the world. And we look forward to working with you going forward. Thank you.